Stop the car right now! The words erupted from my throat with such force that my daughter nearly slammed on the brakes in the middle of downtown Portland. We were heading to the bank, a manila envelope clutched in my trembling hands, when everything my late husband had warned me about suddenly became crystal clear. Inside that envelope was my grandson's college essay, the one that had won him a full scholarship to Stanford. The same essay that had just shattered every belief I held about the young man I thought I knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 74 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office questioning whether my own flesh and blood deserved the inheritance that had been waiting for him since birth. For 18 years, I'd watched my grandson Alex grow up believing he was destined for greatness, that his progressive ideas and modern thinking made him superior to the old-fashioned values my late husband and I had spent our lives upholding. What I discovered in that envelope changed everything I thought I knew about respect, gratitude, and the true meaning of family legacy. My husband Robert and I had emigrated from Taiwan in the early 1970s with nothing but determination and a fierce belief in hard work. Robert started as a dishwasher in a small Chinese restaurant in Seattle's International District, working 16-hour days while I cleaned office buildings at night and took English classes during the day. We saved every penny, sacrificed every comfort, and slowly built what would eventually become a chain of successful restaurants throughout the Pacific Northwest. By the time Robert passed away 3 years ago, we owned 12 establishments and had accumulated enough wealth to ensure our family would never experience the poverty and uncertainty we'd known as young immigrants. The centerpiece of our legacy was a trust fund we'd established for our grandson Alex, our only grandchild, which would mature when he turned 21. The fund contained nearly $2 million, money we'd earned through decades of 18-hour workdays, missed holidays, and countless sacrifices. Alex had been the light of our lives from the moment he was born. Our daughter Sarah, a successful marketing executive, had married a kind man named David, and together they'd given us this precious grandson who seemed to embody all our hopes for the American dream we'd worked so hard to achieve. From his earliest years, Alex was brilliant, articulate, and ambitious in ways that made my heart swell with pride. But somewhere along the way, as Alex moved through his privileged childhood in Sarah and David's suburban Portland home, attending private schools and summer camps that cost more than Robert and I had made in our first 5 years in America, he began to develop a worldview that left me feeling increasingly uncomfortable. By the time he reached high school, family dinners had become intellectual battlegrounds, where Alex would lecture us about social justice, economic inequality, and the evils of capitalism, seemingly oblivious to the irony that his ability to hold such views was entirely funded by his grandparents' capitalist success. "Grandma Maggie," he'd say with the confident tone of someone who'd never missed a meal or worried about rent, "your generation's obsession with hard work and traditional values is exactly what's wrong with America today. You guys created a system that benefits the wealthy while oppressing the working class." I'd listen to these speeches while remembering the feeling of my hands cracking from cleaning chemicals in those frigid office buildings, the way my back ached from standing over restaurant sinks for hours, the fear Robert and I lived with every month, wondering if we'd saved enough to cover both rent and groceries. "Alex," I'd try to explain gently, "those traditional values you dismiss are what built everything you take for granted. Your grandfather and I didn't inherit anything. We created our success through sacrifice and perseverance." But he'd just shake his head with the kind of condescending smile that suggested he knew better than his immigrant grandmother who'd lived through actual hardship. The conversations became more frequent and more painful as Alex prepared for college. He'd been accepted to Stanford with a partial scholarship, but the remaining costs were still substantial. Without hesitation, Sarah and David asked if we could help with the expenses, and of course, we agreed. Education had always been our highest priority, and we were proud to support our grandson's academic pursuits. But even as we wrote checks for his tuition, books, and living expenses, Alex continued to criticize everything we represented. During his freshman year at Stanford, he'd come home for holidays full of new theories about privilege and systemic injustice, apparently unable to see that his ability to attend an elite university without working a part-time job was itself the ultimate privilege. He'd lecture us about the moral failures of older generations while living entirely off the wealth those same generations had created for him. Grandma Maggie, he'd explain with exaggerated patience, as if speaking to a child, your bootstrap mentality is just survivorship bias. The system was different when you were young. Success today requires recognizing and dismantling the structures that allowed some people to accumulate wealth while others suffered. I'd listen to these speeches, remembering the nights Robert and I had sat at our kitchen table counting coins to see if we could afford both electricity and groceries that month. The breaking point came during Alex's junior year at Stanford. He'd been taking a creative writing class and was working on what his professor called a powerful piece of social commentary for a national essay contest sponsored by a progressive think tank. The contest theme was challenging generational assumptions, and Alex was convinced his submission would not only win the $10,000 prize, but also launch his career as a social justice advocate. He was so proud of the essay that he insisted on reading portions of it aloud during family gatherings, his voice filled with the passion of someone who believed he was speaking truth to power. This piece is going to open people's eyes about how toxic traditional values really are, he'd announce, as if his grandmother's presence in the room was irrelevant to his critique of everything she had lived for. The essay was titled The Mythology of Merit, and from what Alex shared with us, it argued that older generations had used concepts like hard work and personal responsibility to justify inequality and suppress social progress. He claimed that his own family's emigration story was actually an example of how the system rewarded those who conformed to oppressive capitalist structures while punishing those who challenged injustice. My grandparents' success story isn't inspiring, he'd read from his laptop screen, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd never wondered where his next meal would come from. I'd sit there, my heart breaking a little more with each word, wondering how the grandson I had helped raise had learned to view our struggles and sacrifices as moral failures rather than acts of love. The essay went on to describe Robert and I as examples of how previous generations had internalized oppressive structures and passed down toxic beliefs about individual responsibility that prevented real social change. According to Alex's analysis, our emphasis on hard work, respect for authority, and financial prudence were not virtues, but rather symptoms of a damaged worldview that needed to be rejected by enlightened younger generations. What hurt most was hearing him describe the restaurants Robert had built as exploitative businesses that perpetuated worker oppression, and our financial success as ill-gotten wealth accumulated through participation in capitalist exploitation. This from a young man who'd never worked a day in his life, whose entire existence had been funded by the very success he was now denouncing as morally corrupt. But I said nothing.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I smiled and nodded and told him I was proud of his academic achievements, because that's what grandmothers do. We support our grandchildren, even when they break our hearts. We love them, even when they reject everything we've stood for. We sacrifice for them, even when they view our sacrifices as evidence of our moral inadequacy. The essay won the contest. Alex received his $10,000 prize and was invited to speak at universities across the country about his groundbreaking analysis of intergenerational value conflicts. He was featured in progressive magazines and online publications as a young voice challenging harmful traditional narratives. His success felt like a public repudiation of everything Robert and I had believed about hard work, respect, and gratitude. Throughout Alex's college years and into his first job at a nonprofit organization in San Francisco, his attitudes toward our family's values only hardened. He'd visit less frequently, and when he did come home, he'd spend most of his time explaining to anyone who'd listen why traditional approaches to success were not only outdated, but actively harmful to society. You have to understand, he'd tell his parents over dinner,
Grandma and Grandpa's generation was raised with this mythology that individual effort determines outcomes. They can't see how their success was actually built on systemic advantages and other people's exploitation. Meanwhile, his rent in San Francisco was being subsidized by monthly checks from the same grandparents whose worldview he was publicly dismantling. The irony was lost on him completely. Here was a young man whose entire life had been made possible by his grandparents' outdated values of hard work and sacrifice, using that privilege to argue that hard work and sacrifice were meaningless concepts invented to justify inequality. He'd never experienced real struggle, never felt the fear of genuine poverty, never had to choose between competing basic needs. And somehow this lack of hardship qualified him to judge those who had. I watched Sarah struggle with her son's attitudes, but felt powerless to intervene. She'd try to gently suggest that perhaps Alex was being too harsh in his judgment of his grandparents, but he'd counter with academic theories about internalized oppression and false consciousness that left her feeling confused and guilty for defending us. As Alex's 21st birthday approached, marking the date when he'd gain access to his trust fund, I found myself lying awake at night wondering what Robert would have wanted me to do. We'd created that fund believing we were giving our grandson the security and opportunities we'd never had. We'd imagined him using the money to start a business, buy a home, or pursue advanced education, building on the foundation we'd laid for him. Instead, Alex had spent years publicly arguing that the very qualities that had enabled us to create his inheritance were harmful relics that needed to be discarded by his generation. He'd made a career out of criticizing the bootstrap mentality while living entirely off the fruits of his grandparents' bootstraps. He'd won awards for essays that portrayed our values as toxic while depending completely on the financial security those values had provided for him. The morning before his 21st birthday, Sarah called to ask if I wanted to join them for Alex's celebration dinner. "He's so excited about finally getting access to the trust fund," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and concern. "He's got all these plans for using the money to support social justice causes and maybe start his own advocacy organization." That's when something inside me shifted. The image of Alex using Robert's and my life savings to fund campaigns against everything we'd believed in felt like a betrayal too profound to ignore. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, gratitude, and the basic human decency to honor those who'd sacrifice for your benefit, even if you disagreed with their methods. I called my lawyer that afternoon and asked about the terms of the trust fund Robert and I had established. The conversation that followed changed everything I thought I knew about my options and my grandson's future. It also led to the discovery that would ultimately send me rushing towards that bank in Portland with my daughter, an envelope in my hands, and a decision that would reshape our entire family's understanding of consequences, gratitude, and the true meaning of values. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened next, you need to know about the phone call I received 2 weeks before Alex's birthday, and the conversation that finally opened my eyes to just how far his disrespect for our family's legacy had really gone. Because what I learned in that phone call made me realize that my grandson's public essays were just the beginning of his campaign against everything Robert and I had worked to build. The call came from Robert's old business partner, Henry Wu, who'd remained close to our family even after selling his share of the restaurants years earlier. Henry had always been like a brother to Robert, and his voice carried a weight of concern that immediately put me on edge. "Maggie," he said carefully, "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I think you need to know what Alex has been saying about you and Robert in his public speeches." My stomach dropped. I'd known Alex was speaking at universities, but I'd assumed his criticisms of traditional values were generic, not personal attacks on his own family. "What kind of things?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "He's been using your immigration story as an example of how older generations were complicit in systemic oppression. Last week at UC Berkeley, He specifically named Robert's restaurants as examples of how immigrant business owners exploited workers and perpetuated capitalist inequality. He said that your generation's obsession with financial success came at the expense of social justice and worker rights. The words hit me like physical blows. Bad enough that Alex held these views privately, but to air them publicly? To use his grandparents' names and businesses as negative examples in his academic presentations felt like a violation of everything family should mean. There's more, Henry continued reluctantly. He's been telling audiences that he plans to use his inheritance to correct the moral failures of his grandparents' generation. He said the money represents accumulated wealth from exploitative practices that needs to be redistributed to undo the harm caused by previous generations' pursuit of profit over people.
Not only was Alex planning to use our money to fund causes that opposed everything we'd believed in, but he was publicly framing our gift to him as some kind of moral obligation, as if he deserved compensation for the supposed sins of his grandparents' success. That night, I pulled out all the documents related to the trust fund and read through them carefully for the first time in years. Robert and I had structured the fund with certain conditions, including a clause that allowed the trustees to withhold distribution if the beneficiary demonstrated, quote, behavior inconsistent with the family values of hard work, respect, and gratitude that this inheritance is intended to honor. At the time we'd written those words, they'd seemed like simple boilerplate language, a way to ensure Alex didn't squander his inheritance on drugs or gambling. We'd never imagined we might need to invoke that clause because our grandson was publicly denouncing the very values we tried to instill in him. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Robert and I had been enablers in our own way. By providing Alex with complete financial security throughout his life, we'd removed any incentive for him to understand the real-world value of hard work and sacrifice. He'd never experienced the character-building struggle that had shaped our own values because we'd been so determined to protect him from the hardships we'd endured. We'd created a situation where our grandson could afford to hold abstract theoretical views about the evils of capitalism because he'd never faced the practical realities that make hard work and financial prudence matters of survival rather than ideology. In trying to give him every advantage, we'd inadvertently raised someone who couldn't appreciate the advantages he'd been given. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate. Robert and I had worked our entire lives to ensure Alex would never know poverty or uncertainty, and our success in achieving that goal had produced a young man who viewed poverty and uncertainty as more morally pure than the security we'd provided for him. As Alex's birthday celebration approached, I found myself facing an impossible choice. I could honor the legal terms of the trust fund and give him the money, knowing he'd use it to attack everything Robert and I had stood for, or I could invoke the value clause and withhold his inheritance, forcing him to face the consequences of his own attitudes for the first time in his privileged life. The decision became clearer when Sarah forwarded me a link to Alex's latest interview with a progressive podcast. In it, he described his upcoming inheritance as blood money from capitalist exploitation that he intended to cleanse through redistribution to worthy social justice causes. He had actually used the phrase blood money to describe the savings his grandparents had accumulated through decades of honest labor. That was the moment I knew what Robert would have wanted me to do. The money wasn't just ours to give, it was our legacy, our values made concrete, our life's work transformed into an opportunity for our grandson to build something meaningful. If Alex viewed that legacy as blood money, if he saw our values as toxic relics to be discarded, then perhaps he needed to learn what life looked like without the benefits those supposedly harmful values had provided. The morning of Alex's 21st birthday, I made a decision that would change our family forever. Instead of celebrating his inheritance, we were going to have a conversation about respect, gratitude, and the real meaning of family legacy. And, depending on how that conversation went,
Alex might discover that his trust fund disagreed very strongly with his assessment of his grandparents' old-fashioned values. The birthday dinner was supposed to be a celebration, but the tension in Sarah's dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Alex sat at the head of the table, practically glowing with anticipation, as he waited for what he clearly believed would be the formality of receiving his inheritance paperwork. David had prepared Alex's favorite meal, and Sarah had even bought a small cake, though her smile seemed forced as she watched her son's eager expressions. "So, Grandma Maggie," Alex said between bites, his voice carrying that familiar tone of someone who assumed he was about to get exactly what he wanted, "I've been thinking about the best ways to utilize the trust fund money. I've already reached out to several organizations that could really benefit from a substantial donation, and I'm considering starting a foundation focused on economic justice initiatives." I set down my fork and looked at him carefully. "Tell me more about these organizations, Alex. What kind of work do they do?" His eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone discussing their passion project. "Well, there's the Workers' Liberation Coalition, which fights against exploitative business practices, like the ones that allowed previous generations to accumulate wealth at the expense of working people. And then there's the Anti-Capitalist Action Network, which works to dismantle systemic structures that perpetuate inequality." Sarah shot me a worried glance across the table. Even she could hear the implicit criticism in her son's words, the way he managed to turn every conversation about his future into an indictment of his family's past. "And you feel these are worthy causes?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Absolutely," Alex replied, without hesitation. "Grandma, I know this might be hard for you to understand, given your generation's attachment to outdated concepts, but using inherited wealth to fight against the systems that created that wealth is actually the most ethical thing I can do. It's a way of acknowledging the harm that was done and working to repair it." The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. Here was my grandson, sitting in his parents' comfortable home, preparing to inherit nearly $2 million that Robert and I had saved penny by penny, describing our life's work as harm that needed to be repaired. The level of ingratitude was so profound that I almost couldn't process it. "Alex," I said slowly, "help me understand something. When you describe your grandfather's restaurants as exploitative, what exactly do you mean?" He leaned forward, clearly delighted to have an opportunity to educate his ignorant grandmother. "Well, for starters, Grandpa Robert paid workers minimum wage while accumulating significant profits for himself. That's a classic example of extracting surplus value from laborers. Plus, he required long hours and didn't provide comprehensive benefits, which is another form of worker exploitation." I felt my hands begin to tremble. "Alex, your grandfather started those restaurants by working 18-hour days for years. He paid his employees above minimum wage, provided health insurance when he could afford it, and promoted from within whenever possible."
Several of his former employees went on to open their own successful businesses with his mentorship and financial support. Alex waved his hand dismissively. "That's just individual success stories that mask the larger pattern of systemic exploitation. Besides, the fact that Grandpa worked long hours doesn't justify imposing those same exploitative conditions on his workers. Those workers volunteered for overtime because the extra money helped them support their families," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Just like your grandfather and I worked those hours to build something better for our children and grandchildren." "But that's exactly the problem," Alex continued, apparently oblivious to my growing distress. "This mythology of hard work and sacrifice is what allows people to justify inequality. The reality is that success in a capitalist system requires taking advantage of others, whether you acknowledge it or not." Sarah cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Alex, honey, maybe we could talk about this another time. This is supposed to be a celebration." "It's fine, Mom," Alex said confidently. "Grandma needs to hear this.
I think once she understands how harmful these traditional values really are, she'll actually be proud that I'm using the inheritance to fight against them. That was the moment I realized that Alex genuinely believed I would applaud his plan to use our money to attack our values. In his mind, his grandparents were so morally confused that we should be grateful for his efforts to correct our mistakes with our own resources. The level of arrogance was breathtaking. "Alex," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out the envelope I'd been carrying, "before we discuss your inheritance plans any further, I'd like you to read something." I handed him a printed copy of his prize-winning essay, the one he'd been so proud of that he'd shared excerpts with the family. His face lit up with pleasure, clearly thinking I was finally ready to appreciate his intellectual achievements. "This is wonderful, Grandma. I'm so glad you want to read my work. This essay really represents everything I believe about challenging harmful generational assumptions." "I've already read it," I said quietly. "I've read it several times, actually, along with transcripts of your speeches at Berkeley and Stanford, and your recent podcast interview where you described your grandfather's money as blood money from capitalist exploitation." The color drained from Alex's face. For the first time in the conversation, he seemed to realize that his grandmother might not be the confused old woman he'd assumed her to be. "Grandma, I can explain." "Please do," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. "Explain to me how using your grandparents' names and businesses as examples of moral failure in your public speeches shows respect for the people who made your entire life possible." Alex glanced nervously at his parents, clearly hoping for support. But Sarah and David were staring at him with expressions of shock and disappointment. Apparently, they hadn't been aware of the extent to which their son had been publicly attacking his own family. "I wasn't attacking you personally," Alex said weakly. "I was critiquing systemic problems that affected entire generations, including yours." "You specifically named Robert's restaurants as examples of exploitative businesses," I said, pulling out my phone and reading from Henry Wu's notes. "You told an audience at UC Berkeley that your grandparents represented how immigrant communities were forced to abandon their values and exploit others to survive in an inherently unjust economic system." That's taken out of context. What context justifies using your family's immigration story as a cautionary tale about moral failure? I asked. What context justifies describing the money your grandparents saved for you as blood money that needs to be cleansed through redistribution? Sarah put her head in her hands. "Alex, how could you say those things? Your grandparents have done nothing but love and support you your entire life." "But that's exactly the problem." Alex burst out, his composure finally cracking. "Their support has been based on perpetuating harmful systems. They've passed down toxic values about individual responsibility and hard work that prevent real social change."
Toxic values? I repeated slowly. "Alex, those toxic values are the reason you've never missed a meal, never worried about having a roof over your head, never had to choose between paying for medicine or paying rent. Those toxic values built the restaurants that funded your private education, your college tuition, and every comfort you've ever enjoyed." "But I never asked for those things," Alex shot back. "I would have been fine without private schools and college funds if it meant my family hadn't participated in oppressive economic systems." The absurdity of his statement hung in the air like smoke. Here was a young man who'd never experienced genuine hardship, claiming he would have preferred poverty to the prosperity his grandparents had worked to provide. It was the kind of statement that could only come from someone who'd never actually faced the choice between comfort and principles in any meaningful way. "Alex," I said carefully, "if you truly believe that your grandfather's success was built on exploitation and that the money he saved for you represents blood money from harmful practices, then surely you wouldn't want to accept that inheritance at all." His eyes widened in panic. For all his talk about the evils of inherited wealth, the prospect of actually giving it up clearly terrified him.
The point isn't to reject the money, it's to use it responsibly to correct the mistakes that were made in accumulating it. So you want to keep the blood money, but use it to attack the people who earned it for you? You're twisting my words, Alex said desperately. I'm trying to honor your legacy by addressing the systemic problems that your generation couldn't see. My legacy, I said, standing up from the table, is not the money, Alex. My legacy is the values your grandfather and I tried to instill in our family. Values like gratitude, respect, hard work, and loyalty. Values you've spent years publicly denouncing as toxic relics that need to be discarded. I walked over to the window and looked out at Sarah's well-maintained garden, thinking about all the hours Robert and I had spent working in our own yard, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing something beautiful. Your grandfather and I created that trust fund because we believed you would use it to build something meaningful, something that honored the sacrifices we made to give you opportunities we never had. I am building something meaningful, Alex protested. I'm working to create a more just society. I turned back to face him, and for the first time in years, I saw past the confident academic facade to the entitled child underneath. Alex, you've never built anything in your life. You've never created a job for another person, never started a business, never risked your own security to provide for anyone else. You've spent your entire adult life critiquing and tearing down, never constructing or contributing. That's not fair, he said, his voice rising. Activism is contribution. Challenging systems is important work. Challenging systems is easy when someone else is paying your bills. It's much harder when you're responsible for creating solutions instead of just identifying problems. Sarah reached across the table and touched my arm gently. Mom, what are you saying exactly? I pulled a legal document from my purse and set it on the table. I'm saying that Robert and I included certain conditions in Alex's trust fund, conditions that allow the trustees to withhold distribution if the beneficiary demonstrates behavior inconsistent with family values of hard work, respect, and gratitude. Alex's face went white. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, I said. For 3 years, I've watched you use platforms funded by your grandfather's success to attack everything he stood for. I've listened to you describe our values as toxic, our work as exploitative, and our gift to you as blood money. Now you want to use that same money to fund organizations dedicated to fighting against everything we believed in? But the money is mine, Alex said, his voice cracking. You promised it to me. We promised it to the grandson we thought we were raising, the one who would appreciate the sacrifices made for him and use his advantages to build something positive in the world. We never imagined we were funding someone who would spend his life attacking us.
David, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. Mrs. Chen, surely there's room for discussion here. Alex is young. He's still figuring out his place in the world. David, Alex is 21 years old, and he's been making these statements publicly for years. This isn't youthful rebellion. It's a fundamental lack of respect for the people who made his comfortable life possible. I gathered my purse and the legal documents, preparing to leave. Alex, if you want access to your trust fund, you're going to need to demonstrate that you understand and appreciate the values it was created to honor. That means no more public speeches attacking your family, no more describing our work as exploitation, and no more plans to use our money to fund causes that oppose everything we believed in. This is blackmail, Alex shouted, jumping up from his chair. No, I said calmly. This is consequences. For the first time in your life, your actions are going to have real-world results that you can't escape through academic theories or political rhetoric. You can't just change the rules now because you don't like my politics. I'm not changing any rules, Alex. I'm enforcing conditions that were always part of the trust agreement. Conditions that your grandfather and I hoped we'd never need to use, because we believed we were raising someone who would naturally embody the values we tried to teach.
Sarah walked me to the door, her face a mixture of embarrassment and concern. Mom, is there any way to work this out? Maybe if Alex apologized. Sarah, this isn't about an apology. This is about fundamental character. Alex doesn't just disagree with our values, he actively campaigns against them while living off the benefits they provided. He needs to decide what's more important to him, his political ideology or his family relationships. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I'd never imagined having to take such drastic action with my own grandson. But relief because I've finally stopped enabling behavior that had been eating away at our family's foundation for years. The next morning, my phone started ringing before 7 a.m. It was Sarah calling to tell me that Alex had spent the night researching trust law and was threatening to hire a lawyer to challenge my decision. By noon, I'd received calls from David, several of Alex's friends, and even his college advisor, all trying to convince me to reconsider. But the call that surprised me most came from Henry Wu. "Maggie," he said, his voice warm with approval, "I heard what happened at dinner last night. Robert would be so proud of you for standing up for your values." "I hope I'm doing the right thing, Henry. Part of me feels like I'm being too harsh." "Too harsh?" Henry laughed. "Maggie, you and Robert worked your entire lives to give that boy every advantage, and he's been using those advantages to attack you publicly. The only thing that's harsh is how long you waited to set some boundaries." That afternoon, Alex showed up at my front door, his usual confidence replaced by a desperate kind of energy that made him look younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen him in years. "Grandma, please, we need to talk about this," he said, his voice shaking. "I think there's been a huge misunderstanding." I invited him in and made tea, hoping we could finally have an honest conversation without the defensive posturing that had characterized our recent interactions. "Alex," I said as we sat in my living room, "help me understand what I've misunderstood. Have you not been giving speeches that criticize your grandfather's businesses as exploitative?" "Yes, but have you not described the money he saved for you as blood money from capitalist exploitation?" "I didn't mean it personally." "Have you not planned to use your inheritance to fund organizations that fight against everything your grandfather and I believed in?" Alex was quiet for a long moment, apparently realizing that there was no way to reframe his actions as anything other than what they were. "Grandma," he said finally, "I was trying to make the world a better place. Everything I've done has been motivated by wanting to create a more just society." "Alex, wanting to create a better world is admirable. But you've been trying to do it by tearing down people who loved you, using resources provided by the very people you're attacking. That's not justice. It's ingratitude on a scale that takes my breath away." He sat there staring at his hands, and for the first time since his childhood, I saw genuine remorse in his expression. "I never thought about it that way," he said quietly. "I guess I got so caught up in my political beliefs that I stopped thinking about how my words might hurt you and Grandpa." "Alex, it's not just about hurt feelings. It's about basic human decency. Your grandfather worked himself to exhaustion for decades to give you opportunities he never had. The least you could do is show some gratitude instead of using his success as a platform to attack his character." We talked for 2 hours that afternoon, and for the first time in years, Alex listened more than he spoke. He asked questions about his grandfather's early years in America, about the struggles he'd never heard because Robert had been too proud to burden his family with stories of hardship. He seemed genuinely shocked to learn about the nights we'd eaten rice and canned vegetables so we could save money for the restaurant, or the times Robert had worked with pneumonia because we couldn't afford to close for a day. "I always thought success came easily to you guys," Alex admitted. "I thought you just got lucky with the restaurants and that's why you had money." "Luck had nothing to do with it," I said. Your grandfather's success came from getting up every morning and choosing to work towards something better, even when it seemed impossible. It came from treating customers and employees with respect, from reinvesting profits instead of spending them on luxuries, from making sacrifices today so tomorrow could be better. "Those are the values you want me to embrace?" Alex asked. "Those are the values your inheritance was meant to honor," I said. "The question is whether you can find a way to pursue your vision of social justice while also respecting the people and principles that made your activism possible." Alex left that afternoon promising to think seriously about everything we'd discussed. But I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his genuine love for his family and his commitment to ideologies that demanded he view that family as morally compromised. I knew the real test would come in the following weeks, when he had to decide whether his political beliefs were more important than his relationships with the people who loved him most. And I knew that whatever he chose would determine not just his access to the trust fund, but the future of our entire family's connection to each other. 3 weeks passed before I heard from Alex again. During that time, Sarah called me daily with updates that ranged from encouraging to heartbreaking. Alex had apparently spent days researching our family's immigration history, reading old letters Robert had written to his brother back in Taiwan, and even visiting the original restaurant location where his grandfather had started washing dishes nearly 50 years ago. "He's been asking so many questions," Sarah told me during one of our conversations. "Questions about things he never seemed curious about before. He wanted to know how many hours a day Grandpa worked when he first arrived, what you and Dad ate during those early years, how long it took before you could afford your first car." I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps our difficult conversation had planted seeds that were finally beginning to grow. But I also knew that intellectual understanding and genuine transformation were two very different things. Alex had spent years building his identity around his progressive politics and his critique of traditional values. Changing that worldview would require more than just learning family history. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Alex showed up at my door unannounced, carrying a laptop bag and looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Grandma Maggie, I need to show you something, and I need to ask you a favor that I'm not sure I deserve." I invited him in, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly as he opened his laptop. Whatever he'd been wrestling with had clearly taken a toll on him. "I've been doing research," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Not just about our family, but about the organizations I wanted to donate to, the causes I thought were so important." He turned the laptop screen toward me, showing what appeared to be financial documents and organizational charts. "Alex, what am I looking at?" "The Workers' Liberation Coalition that I was so excited to support? It turns out their leadership makes six-figure salaries while the actual workers they claim to represent see almost none of the donation money. The Anti-Capitalist Action Network? 3 of their board members own investment portfolios worth millions. They're literally capitalists running an anti-capitalist organization." I studied the documents he'd compiled, impressed by the thoroughness of his research. "How did you discover all this?" I started asking the same questions about them that I've been asking about my grandfather's businesses. I applied the same critical analysis to my heroes that I'd been applying to my family. And what I found was that the people I wanted to give money to are exactly the kind of exploitative opportunists I accused my grandfather of being, except they're actually guilty of the things I falsely accused him of being. He scrolled through more documents showing the evidence of financial mismanagement, inflated administrative costs, and board members who used donation funds for personal expenses.
These organizations aren't fighting exploitation, Grandma. They're profiting from it while convincing people like me that we're supporting noble causes. Alex, I appreciate you sharing this with me, but why are you showing me this research? He closed the laptop and looked at me directly for the first time since arriving. Because I've been wrong about everything. Wrong about Grandpa's businesses. Wrong about the values you tried to teach me. Wrong about the organizations I wanted to support. But mostly, I've been wrong about what it means to actually make a positive difference in the world. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. I could see that acknowledging his mistakes was genuinely difficult for Alex, perhaps the hardest thing he'd ever done. I went back to the original restaurant location, he continued. Did you know that Mrs. Patterson still lives in the apartment above what used to be the kitchen? She's 91 now, and she told me stories about Grandpa that I'd never heard. What kind of stories? She said that when her husband died and she couldn't afford the rent on their apartment, Grandpa not only let her stay for free, but hired her to help with bookkeeping even though she had no experience. When her grandson needed surgery they couldn't afford, Grandpa paid for it and never asked to be repaid. She said he did things like that constantly, helping people quietly without ever talking about it or using it for publicity. Alex's voice was getting stronger as he spoke, as if telling these stories was helping him find his footing again. Mrs. Patterson said Grandpa used to tell her that success meant having enough to help others when they needed it, but that real help was giving people opportunities to help themselves, not just handouts that made them dependent. That sounds like something Robert would say, I agreed. He believed that dignity came from being able to contribute, not from being rescued. I've been thinking about that a lot, Alex said. About the difference between helping people and enabling them. About the difference between fighting injustice and just complaining about successful people. I think I confused activism with actual contribution. He reached into his laptop bag and pulled out a thick folder. Grandma, I have a proposal for you. A way that I'd like to use the trust fund money if you'll consider giving me another chance. I opened the folder to find a detailed business plan complete with financial projections, market research, and operational timelines. The document was professionally prepared and thoroughly researched, unlike anything Alex had ever shown me before. What am I looking at, Alex? A plan to open a culinary training center for unemployed and underemployed adults, he said, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he explained. Not a charity that just gives people money, but a program that teaches real skills that lead to real jobs in restaurants, catering companies, and food service businesses. I read through the proposal, impressed by its comprehensiveness and practical focus. This is quite different from your previous plans. I spent 2 weeks interviewing restaurant owners, cooking school instructors, and people who've been struggling to find stable employment. What I learned is that there's a huge demand for skilled food service workers, but a lot of people can't afford formal culinary training. This program would bridge that gap by providing free training in exchange for a commitment to work in local restaurants that partner with us. The plan included partnerships with existing restaurants for job placement, relationships with suppliers for ingredient donations, and a mentorship program connecting graduates with experienced chefs. It was practical, sustainable, and focused on creating real opportunities rather than just redistributing wealth. Alex, this is impressive work. But what made you choose this particular approach? Honestly, I kept thinking about what Grandpa would do if he were trying to address unemployment and economic inequality today. He wouldn't just write checks or organize protests. He'd create jobs, teach skills, and build something that could keep helping people long after he was gone. I felt tears forming in my eyes as I recognized Robert's philosophy reflected in his grandson's words. This was the first time Alex had ever tried to honor his grandfather's approach rather than oppose it. There's something else, Alex said, pulling out a handwritten letter. I wrote a formal apology that I want to read at every university where I gave those speeches criticizing you and Grandpa. I want to publicly correct the record and explain how wrong I was about our family's story. He handed me the letter, and I read through his carefully crafted words, acknowledging his mistakes and expressing genuine respect for his grandparents' achievements. It was thorough, humble, and clearly difficult for someone who had built his reputation on his original critique.
Alex, are you sure you want to do this? Publicly admitting you are wrong about something you've been advocating for years could be professionally embarrassing. Grandma, what's embarrassing is that I spent years attacking people who loved me while claiming to fight for justice. If I'm not willing to face the consequences of my mistakes, then I haven't learned anything from this experience. I set the letter down and looked at my grandson, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since he'd become an adult. The arrogant young man who had lectured me about the evils of traditional values was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely committed to understanding and honoring his family's legacy. Alex, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you doing this because you genuinely believe it's right, or because you want access to the trust fund? He was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the question. 6 months ago, I would have said I was doing it for the right reasons while actually being motivated by the money. Today, I can honestly say that even if you decided never to give me the inheritance, I'd still want to pursue this training center project, and I'd still want to correct the public record about our family. How can you be sure? Because I've already started, he said, reaching into his bag again and pulling out a bank statement. I used the $10,000 from that essay contest to fund the initial research and development for this project. The money I won for attacking Grandpa's values is now being used to honor them. The statement showed expenses for market research, legal consultations, and program development, all related to the Culinary Training Center. Alex had put his own money where his mouth was, investing in his new vision before asking for family support. I have also been working with David on a smaller pilot program, Alex continued. We're starting with just 5 students and 1 partner restaurant, using space donated by the owner of the place where Grandpa used to work. If it succeeds, we'll expand. If it fails, we'll learn from the mistakes and try again. Your father is involved in this? Dad has been incredible. He's helping with the business planning and accounting, and he's been teaching me things about running a sustainable operation that I never learned in college. Practical things about cash flow, employee management, and customer service. I felt a warmth spreading through my chest as I realized that this project was bringing my family together in ways that Alex's previous activism never had. Instead of driving wedges between generations, his new focus was creating opportunities for collaboration and mutual respect. Alex, what changed your mind about all of this? What made you start questioning your previous beliefs? He leaned back in his chair, considering the question carefully. Honestly, it was realizing that I'd never actually built anything positive in my life. I'd spent years tearing down and criticizing, but I'd never created a single job for another person, never solved a real problem for anyone who was struggling. I was basically a professional complainer who had convinced himself that complaining was the same as contributing. And now? Now I want to build something that would make Grandpa proud. Something that helps people develop skills and dignity, not just receive handouts. Something that grows stronger over time instead of just consuming resources. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Robert and I had tended together for so many years. In the distance, I could see the elementary school where Sarah had attended classes, where Alex had played on the playground as a child, where my great-grandchildren might someday learn to read and write. Alex, I said, turning back to face him, your grandfather always said that the true test of any investment was whether it created value for other people, not just profit for yourself. This training center proposal passes that test in ways that your previous plans never could have. Does that mean you'll consider releasing the trust fund? It means I'm proud of the man you're becoming, I said, sitting back down across from him. The money was always meant to help you build something meaningful. If you're committed to this project, if you're willing to learn from your grandfather's example instead of rejecting it, then yes, I think we can discuss restoring your access to the inheritance. Alex's face lit up with relief and gratitude, but I could see that his excitement was focused on the project itself, rather than just the money. That shift in priorities told me more about his transformation than any words could have. Over the following months, I watched Alex throw himself into the culinary training program with an energy and dedication I'd never seen from him before. He worked with local restaurant owners to understand their hiring needs, collaborated with unemployment agencies to identify potential students, and spent countless hours developing curricula that balance practical skills with professional development. The pilot program launched with 5 students and exceeded every expectation. All 5 graduates found jobs within 2 weeks of completing the training, and the partner restaurant was so impressed that they immediately requested 5 more trainees for the next session. More importantly, I watched Alex develop genuine relationships with the people he was trying to help. Instead of speaking about economic inequality in abstract, theoretical terms, he was working directly with individuals who faced real challenges, learning about their specific situations and developing practical solutions. You know what surprised me most? Alex told me during one of our regular dinners together. The people in our program don't want charity or sympathy. They want the same thing Grandpa wanted when he came to America, a real opportunity to build something better through their own effort. And what have you learned from working with them? That dignity comes from contributing, not from being rescued. That the best help you can give someone is the skills and knowledge they need to help themselves. That success isn't about having money, it's about having the ability to create value for other people. By the end of Alex's first year running the training center, the program had expanded to include 3 partner restaurants, 15 graduates who had all found permanent employment, and a waiting list of potential students that stretched for months. The success was so remarkable that other cities began reaching out to Alex for guidance on replicating the model. The young man who had once dismissed his grandfather's values as toxic relics had become a living embodiment of those same values, creating opportunities for others while building something sustainable and meaningful. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, but we'd learned to see it as evidence of growth rather than contradiction. On the second anniversary of that difficult birthday dinner, we held a celebration at the original restaurant location where Robert had started his American journey. Alex had arranged for all the training center graduates to attend, along with their families and the restaurant owners who had hired them. As I watched my grandson speak to the crowd about the importance of hard work, perseverance, and creating opportunities for others, I felt Robert's presence in the room as strongly as if he'd been standing beside me. Alex's words echoed in his grandfather's philosophy so perfectly that several people commented on the family resemblance, not just in appearance, but in character. My grandfather taught me that success isn't about what you accumulate for yourself, Alex told the gathering. It's about what you create for others. This training center exists because he and my grandmother showed me what it means to build something that lasts, something that keeps helping people long after you're gone. After the celebration, Alex and I sat together in my kitchen, sharing tea and reflecting on how much had changed since that confrontational birthday dinner 2 years earlier. Grandma, can I ask you something that's been on my mind? Of course. Sweetheart, do you think Grandpa would have been proud of how everything turned out? Not just the training center, but the way I finally learned to appreciate what he tried to teach me? I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses he'd developed from working in the training center kitchen alongside his students. Alex, your grandfather would be amazed by what you've accomplished. But more than that, he'd be proud of who you've become. Someone who builds instead of just criticizing. Someone who creates opportunities instead of just pointing out problems. I wish I could tell him I'm sorry for all those years I spent attacking everything he stood for. Honey, your grandfather knew that young people sometimes need to reject their elders' values before they can truly understand and embrace them. He would have seen your transformation as proof that the foundation he built was strong enough to support whatever you chose to build on top of it. Today, Alex's Culinary Training Center has helped over 200 people develop skills that change their lives. The program has been replicated in 8 other cities, and Alex has been invited to speak at conferences about sustainable approaches to workforce development. But the achievement I'm most proud of is simpler than any of those accolades.
Last month, Alex called to tell me that one of his first students had saved enough money to open her own small catering business. She'd invited him to the grand opening, and when she gave a speech thanking everyone who had helped her succeed, she specifically mentioned learning from Alex that success means creating opportunities for others, not just advancing yourself. "Grandma," Alex said, his voice filled with wonder, "she's already talking about hiring other graduates from our program. The values Grandpa taught us aren't just surviving, they're multiplying." That's when I knew that Robert's legacy was truly secure. Not because Alex had inherited money, but because he had inherited something far more valuable. The understanding that true wealth comes from what you build for others, and that the best inheritance you can leave is the knowledge of how to create opportunities rather than just consume them. The old-fashioned values that Alex once dismissed as meaningless have become the foundation of everything meaningful in his life. And his trust fund, which he almost lost through his own arrogance and ingratitude, now funds work that would make his grandfather proud in ways that no amount of money ever could. Sometimes the most important lessons can only be learned through consequences. And sometimes love means being willing to let someone face those consequences instead of protecting them from the results of their choices. In the end, Alex's trust fund didn't just disagree with his dismissal of traditional values. It taught him that those values were the only foundation strong enough to build a life worth living. As I reflect on everything that happened during those transformative years, I'm struck by how close we came to losing each other completely. There were moments during Alex's most defiant period when I wondered if the gulf between our worldviews had grown too wide to bridge. The night after that confrontational birthday dinner, I lay awake questioning whether I'd been too harsh, whether cutting off his inheritance would only drive him further away from the family values Robert and I had tried to instill. Sarah called me the morning after our showdown, her voice thick with worry and confusion. "Mom, Alex didn't come home last night. David found him sleeping in his car in our driveway. He's devastated, but he's also angrier than I've ever seen him. He keeps saying you've destroyed his future over political differences." "Sarah, this isn't about politics," I explained, though I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "This is about basic respect and gratitude."
Alex has been using our family's story as ammunition for his public campaigns while living entirely off the benefits of our success. That's not political disagreement, that's fundamental character failure. But even as I said the words, I wondered if I was being fair. Was it reasonable to expect a young man to share his grandparents' exact values? Was withholding his inheritance an act of tough love, or just stubborn pride on my part? These questions haunted me during those first difficult weeks when Alex refused to speak to any of us. The turning point came not from any grand gesture or dramatic confrontation, but from something much quieter and more personal. 3 weeks after our confrontation, I received a handwritten letter in the mail, addressed in Alex's familiar scrawl, but lacking his usual confident tone. "Dear Grandma Maggie," the letter began, "I've been thinking about something you said during our fight, about how I've never built anything in my life. At first, I was angry because I thought you were dismissing my activism and advocacy work. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized you were right in a way I didn't want to admit." The letter went on for several pages, detailing his growing doubts about the organizations he'd wanted to support, and his increasing awareness of how privileged his perspective had been. But what struck me most was a paragraph near the end where he wrote about visiting Robert's grave for the first time since the funeral. "I sat there by Grandpa's headstone for almost 2 hours, trying to imagine what he would say to me if he could see how I've been behaving. Not the political arguments or the academic theories, but just the basic question of whether I've been a good grandson to the people who sacrificed everything for my opportunities. I couldn't convince myself that he'd be proud of the man I've become, and that realization broke something inside me that I didn't know needed breaking." Reading those words, I felt my anger begin to transform into something more like hope. For the first time, Alex seemed to be questioning not just his tactics, but his fundamental assumptions about what it meant to make a positive difference in the world. The letter concluded with a simple request.
Would you be willing to teach me about Grandpa's early years in America? Not for any political purpose or public project, but just because I'm realizing how little I actually know about the man whose values I've been rejecting. I want to understand what shaped him into the person you both became. That letter opened a door between us that had been closed for years. Over the following months, I shared stories with Alex that I'd never told anyone, including memories too painful for casual conversation. I told him about the winter when Robert worked 3 jobs while battling bronchitis because we couldn't afford both medicine and rent. I described the humiliation he felt when customers at the restaurant treated him like he was invisible, and how he channeled that pain into determination to build something that would command respect. I explained how Robert's emphasis on hard work wasn't just about financial success, but about dignity and self-respect. Your grandfather believed that the ability to provide for your family through honest labor was the foundation of all other freedoms, I told Alex during one of our long conversations. He'd seen what happened to people who lost that ability, how dependence could destroy a person's sense of worth. These conversations helped Alex understand that his grandfather's values weren't abstract principles, but practical wisdom earned through real struggle. Robert's belief in personal responsibility wasn't about ignoring systemic problems or blaming individuals for circumstances beyond their control. It was about maintaining agency and dignity, even in the face of genuine hardship. What surprised me most was how eager Alex became to learn these stories, how he'd call me with follow-up questions and ask for details about aspects of Robert's journey that he'd never shown interest in before. It was as if he was discovering a grandfather he'd never really known, despite having spent 18 years in the same family. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Even after Alex began his research into the organizations he'd planned to support, even after he started developing his culinary training center proposal, there were moments when his old assumptions would surface. During one particularly difficult conversation, he accused me of trying to reprogram him to accept conservative political views. "Alex," I said, as gently as I could, "I'm not trying to change your politics. I'm trying to help you understand the difference between fighting for justice and attacking people who love you. Your grandfather was a lifelong Democrat who believed in civil rights, worker protections, and social safety nets. But he also believed that personal character and individual effort mattered, and that success carried obligations to help others." So you're saying I can care about social justice as long as I don't criticize capitalism? I'm saying you can criticize anything you want, but you should do it honestly and with respect for the people who made your comfortable life possible. If you believe capitalism is inherently exploitative, then you should refuse to accept money earned through capitalist enterprises. If you think traditional values are toxic, then you should be willing to live without the benefits those values provided for you. That conversation helped Alex understand that integrity requires consistency between beliefs and actions. If he truly believed his grandfather's success was built on exploitation, then accepting that inheritance would make him complicit in the same system he claimed to oppose. The realization forced him to choose between his ideological purity and his financial security, a choice he'd never had to make before. Watching Alex work through this conflict was both painful and inspiring. For the first time in his life, he was grappling with real consequences for his beliefs, rather than just abstract intellectual positions. The process was humbling in ways that seemed to genuinely surprise him. "I never realized how easy it was to hold strong opinions when someone else was paying for my ability to have them," he told me during one of our regular dinners. Living off Grandpa's success while criticizing everything he stood for was incredibly hypocritical, but I couldn't see it because I'd never had to face the practical implications of my beliefs. The development of the Culinary Training Center became a kind of laboratory for Alex to test whether his values could create positive change in the real world. Instead of just critiquing existing systems, he had to build something that actually worked, that served real people with genuine needs.
The process taught him lessons that no amount of academic study could have provided. The difference between theory and practice is huge, Alex explained after his first month of running the pilot program. In theory, creating opportunities for unemployed people sounds simple. In practice, you have to deal with transportation issues,
childcare problems, learning disabilities, addiction recovery, family crises, and a dozen other complications that the textbooks never mention. These practical challenges forced Alex to develop qualities he'd never needed before: patience, flexibility, problem-solving skills, and the ability to work with people whose life experiences were completely different from his own. The young man who had once lectured his grandmother about social justice began learning from students who had lived through genuine hardship. One of his first students was Maria, a single mother who had been unemployed for 8 months after her factory job was eliminated. During their initial interview, Alex tried to discuss the systemic factors that had contributed to her situation, but Maria interrupted him with a directness that completely changed his perspective. "Look, kid," she said, "I don't need you to explain why I'm poor. I need you to teach me skills that will help me get a job that pays enough to feed my children. Can you do that? Or are we just here to talk about politics?" That conversation became a turning point for Alex, helping him understand that real help meant providing practical solutions rather than ideological analysis. Maria didn't need someone to validate her experience of economic hardship. She needed someone to give her tools for overcoming it. By the end of the training program, Maria had not only mastered the culinary skills they taught, but had also developed enough confidence to negotiate a starting wage higher than what the restaurant initially offered. When she called Alex to tell him about her first promotion 6 months later, she said something that he still quotes today. "Thank you for teaching me how to fish instead of just giving me a fish." These successes began to reshape Alex's understanding of what meaningful change looked like. Instead of grand political movements or sweeping social reforms, he was learning that real progress often happened one person at a time through individual relationships and practical assistance. The ripple effects of this new approach extended far beyond the training center. Alex began volunteering at other local organizations, but his contribution style had changed completely. Instead of arriving with theories about how things should be done differently, he showed up asking how he could be useful and what needed to be accomplished. "I used to think that pointing out problems was the same as solving them," Alex reflected during one of our conversations. "Now I realize that identifying issues is just the first step. The real work is figuring out practical solutions and then putting in the effort to implement them." This shift in perspective also transformed Alex's relationships with other family members. David, who had been somewhat intimidated by his son's academic confidence, found himself becoming a mentor as Alex sought practical business advice for the training center. Sarah, who had felt caught between her son's politics and her parents' values, watched with relief as the family began working together towards common goals. The most profound change, however, was in Alex's relationship with Robert's memory. What had once been a source of conflict and criticism became a source of guidance and inspiration. Alex began asking himself not what progressive activists would think about his decisions, but what his grandfather would have done in similar circumstances. "Grandpa becomes more real to me every day," Alex told me recently. "Not as some perfect figure from the past, but as someone who faced difficult choices and tried to do the right thing even when it was hard. I find myself wondering how he managed to maintain his optimism and work ethic despite all the discrimination and hardship he faced." Today, when Alex speaks to groups about the training center or workforce development, he often begins by talking about his grandfather's journey from dishwasher to successful business owner. But instead of using that story as an example of individual success in an unjust system, he presents it as evidence of what becomes possible when someone combines personal determination with community support. The young man who had once dismissed his grandfather's values as toxic relics now sees them as timeless principles that can guide efforts for social justice and economic equality. He's learned that hard work and social consciousness aren't contradictory forces, but complementary aspects of a life dedicated to meaningful contribution. The trust fund that almost became a source of permanent division between us has instead become the foundation for work that honors both Robert's legacy and Alex's generation's desire for positive change. The money that was once going to fund organizations that attacked everything we believed in now supports programs that embody those beliefs while addressing contemporary challenges. As I watch Alex continue to grow into the man his grandfather always hoped he would become, I'm grateful for the difficult decision I made that night after his 21st birthday celebration. Sometimes love requires the courage to let people face consequences for their choices, even when those consequences are painful for everyone involved. Sometimes the most important gift you can give someone is the opportunity to discover their own strength and character through genuine challenge rather than artificial protection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.